All right, okay, everyone can hear me? Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alex, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. So as introduced, I used to be in the Army, and I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about how I got from that world into the world that I'm currently in, which is my current role as a CEO of a tech startup in the blockchain and cryptocurrency space. And a lot of people, this is a story I tell a lot because a lot of people ask me, they're like, hey, you were an Army officer and Green Beret, and now you're in tech and blockchain of all things. So the story, I think, is useful in that it illustrates to me what I think are some of the most important and special things about this technology and why people should potentially care about it. And that's really going to be the focus of this talk today. So hate to disappoint anyone if if you were expecting a 101 on what blockchain is. It's not going to be what today is. But today's going to be more of a why you should care about it. And I'm going to kind of illustrate why through my story. Okay, oh yeah, Baghdad to Bitcoin. Let's go back. So, so I just kind of talked through, like I said, and I guess just maybe quickly on my background. So I commissioned in the Army as an infantry officer in 2008 in the middle of the global war on terror. My first deployment was to Afghanistan, and then I also did 2 more deployments, one to Iraq in 2014, and then one to Turkey, where I was working with the Syrian rebels, many of whom were refugees from the civil war in 2015. A16Z crypto, for those of you who don't know, was my first job after the Army, after I went to grad school, and that is a $28 billion venture fund where I really had my first professional experience in the industry. Okay, so why did I join the Army? Photos, hopefully self-explanatory. I was in high school when 9/11 happened, and so it deeply affected me and kind of pushed me down the path of military service. Let me stay in the light here. And also, in addition to this particular event, which was obviously a major event in my life, I come from a military family, and there's a history and a legacy of service that I come from. So 4 generations before me all served in the U.S. military. My great-grandfather was in World War I, my grandfather was in Vietnam, and my dad served as a Special Forces sergeant in the 1980s. And so to me, this was kind of following along the path that I was meant to follow in many ways, given the circumstances and given the background of my family. So anyway, this is actually, so my granddad is on the left there, my dad on the right. My dad's in the audience here, by the way, so you can meet him later. This is my commissioning day. So this is when I got my lieutenant bars, and I formally became a U.S. Army officer. Cool, and I graduated West Point 2008, like I said, and very shortly afterwards found myself in Afghanistan. And this is actually a picture of Afghanistan. It's not Montana, it's actually Afghanistan. But yeah, one of the most stunningly beautiful places that I've ever been, and also one of the poorest places. If you don't have to look at too much economic data to convince yourself that Afghanistan is nowhere near the top of any development index, and in fact, it's usually at the bottom. And so, in fact, because of that, I think a lot of people have a perception of, what do you do in the Army when you're deployed? You combat and stuff. And while I was in over 300 firefights and went on, combat patrols every day, actually the focus of our mission in Afghanistan was not fighting, because the type of war we were waging was a counterinsurgency, and so the insurgencies was basically a rebellion against the government that we were supporting, and so oftentimes those insurgencies play on the poor economic conditions of the country that they're in, and that's what these insurgents were doing. So our mission, largely, was to try and solve those problems. So this is one of the programs that we worked on to do that, was encourage economic development for the farmers that were there. So the economy, by and large, in that place was subsistence farmers, and one of the things that we tried to do was subsidize the farmers to grow different kinds of crops, do crop diversification to just increase their yield, and this is a picture of me at a district center in a town called Nangalam, which is where our base was, and sorting through a spreadsheet of different people's addresses, quote unquote, and their plots of land, and trying to figure out how to pay people. And it was a complete and total nightmare for one very important reason. Is you can just look at the papers on the table there and see, it's like, okay, well, how in God's name are you going to be able to organize all these payments? I mean, isn't there some kind of system of record? Like, do people have titles? And the answer to all that is no. There is no system of records at all in Afghanistan. In fact, it was kind of comical. We would go around to these different villages to survey fields, and different people would come out and claim the same field, right? So So you can imagine being a foreigner, a 23-year-old second lieutenant in the Army trying to sort through who owned what as being a total nightmare to try and navigate. And that was one of the reasons why that and many other of our development efforts failed, was because we had no foundational system of institutions to build upon. Institutions that we take for granted in the US, like a land registration, a system of land registration, for example. So this was one of my formative experiences in the military. Working with the Afghans kind of side by side inspired me to go and try out for Special Forces, and I joined Special Forces in 2014, like I mentioned, and my next deployment then was to Iraq. So I went to Iraq in 2014 after Afghanistan, and here kind of faced a different problem. So in 2014, many of you probably remember, was when the rise of ISIS happened. So ISIS, a terrorist group, kind of arose from the ashes of Al-Qaeda in Iraq that was operating from 2003 to 2011 or so. And in 2014, kind of they made this massive comeback, took over the northern third of the country, and were threatening not only all the neighboring countries around Iraq, but also Europe and the U.S. In fact, there were several terrorist attacks outside of Iraq that were perpetrated by ISIS. And so my team was one of the 6 teams, the first 6 teams that was sent there to address that threat. But one of the questions that was on our mind as we were going to Iraq was, how is it possible that a country like Iraq and a government that has received tens of billions of dollars of US aid and years of training from the top, from the best the US military has to offer, how did that fall to a bunch of ragtag guys in trucks? And we got on the ground, we started kind of stabilizing the lines and trying to, train and assist as best as we could. But it quickly became clear the answer to the question that I just posed. And that is that almost all of the money that had been earmarked for the Iraqi army had been going into pockets of corrupt bureaucrats or senior officers. Almost all of the people that were supposed to be in the army were in fact just ghost soldiers, and they were on payrolls, but they actually didn't exist. And again, all of that money that was going to pay their wages was in fact just going into the pockets of these corrupt individuals. And all of the materials and weapons and ammunition we gave them were supposed to equip these soldiers, who in fact weren't real, were all being funneled off to different sectarian militias. So at the end of the day, despite all of that effort, despite all of that money, despite all of that aid, despite all of that goodwill, it had all ended up being for nothing. And we were there just trying to pick up the pieces again. So like this is actually a picture from northern Iraq. This is a unit of Kurdish forces called Peshmerga. This is kind of like the equivalent of their National Guard, and Kurdish people are the main ethnic group that live in northern Iraq, and primarily the people that we worked with. And they started with nothing. So again, despite all of that investment, despite all that time, despite all that money, we as a team representing the United States of America had to start again from square one. So the problem in this case, so I kind of talked about Afghanistan. The main challenge was like, look, there just was no institutions to build upon, which made getting people to believe in the government and the efforts that we were working on very difficult. In this case, there was a system. It was just hopelessly corrupt, right? So all this money, aid, et cetera, was getting funneled off to the wrong place. And there was no way to audit that it was in fact going to its intended purpose. So this was kind of the second, my second formative experience in the military. And lastly, I'm going to talk about my last deployment going to Turkey, where I really spent a lot of time on the Turkish-Syrian border working with the Syrian rebels to help train them to fight ISIS. In reality, they were fighting a two-front war, fighting against ISIS, but also against the Syrian government, which was trying to stamp out a rebellion that was going on in mostly the northern and the eastern part of the country. And this is, I think, it's pretty crazy and stark to think about the extent to which this country went from being actually relatively well off to being completely devastated. So this is a picture of Aleppo before 2014. So 2014 is when the Syrian civil war broke out. So this is a picture of Aleppo in 2014, and then, there we go. This is the same picture, same street in 2018. So absolutely, completely devastated. And as a result, like I said, we were training rebels who were fighting both the Assad regime and ISIS, and many of those people actually had come or were refugees from this conflict, as you can imagine. And many of them had come from the upper echelons of society. They were doctors, they were dentists, they were lawyers. And, I couldn't help but think to myself over and over again that, man, if it weren't for, but for this time and circumstance that these people were born, in Syria at the time of the Civil War, like I could see myself and my family being in similar situations, right? These are people that played by the rules their whole lives. And suddenly the rules changed. The Civil War broke out. Through no fault of their own, they end up being on the wrong side of a conflict, have to flee for their lives, and end up oftentimes in the process giving up all their wealth or leaving it behind, and leaving behind passports or identity documents or birth certificates or other records that they can no longer then get access to. And then they, like tens of millions of other people in the Middle East, because of the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and other places, end up in a refugee camp like this. And it's hard to overstate the challenge that these people face. I mean, it's going from basically having a life with a house and a family and plans for sending your kids to college in Europe to living hand to mouth in a refugee camp like this. And these people were victims of a system that had completely turned against them. And when it did turn against them, they had absolutely no recourse to do anything. And so this was, to me, one of the final formative experience of the military. And this was around the time I was considering what to do next with my life. And I kind of knew I wanted to get into tech because tech had seemed like an area, looking from afar, that was going to change the world. I mean, I grew up in the era of, the internet, like when the internet was basically invented and the web browser kind of popularized it and made it accessible to millions and now billions of people. But I wanted to think about how technology could address the fundamental problems that I had witnessed in the military. And for me, I wanted to, again, I joined to serve, and I wanted to, I still wanted to feel like I was serving in some way. And I started contemplating, okay, in all of these situations, like what is the common thread here? And often, well, actually, every time when I really started thinking about it, it was the lack of economic opportunity oftentimes led to people becoming radicalized, and and then they had no recourse and nowhere to go, and other than to turn to these various terrorist groups to make ends meet, right? So it was really figuring out how to address that lack of opportunity and figure out to give people access to these systems that we in the West take entirely for granted. So like the last kind of bottom here, the bottom square, is the lack of trusted institutions. I think that's just one thing I wanted to highlight that I realized really firsthand through my time in the Middle East, is that things we take for granted, like a tax office or a patent office or a place where that issues your house deed. Like many of these things we take for granted, but they don't exist in places like Afghanistan, for example. And so this is in the course of kind of contemplating what I wanted to do next. This is when I discovered Bitcoin. So for those of you who don't know, Bitcoin was the first cryptocurrency that was kind of launched or started in 2008, and it's fundamentally an electronic peer-to-peer payment system. And the key piece there is that it uses cryptographic proofs instead of trusted institutions to let people interact directly, as opposed to through these various institutions. And that's extremely important to me because, actually I'll get to this slide in a second. I think that was the really critical unlock for me, is thinking about, okay, well, in all these places where there either were no institutions, or the institutions were corrupt, or the institutions had turned against the people they were supposed to serve, like the only recourse that someone would have, for example, a Syrian refugee fleeing across the border, if they were able to store their wealth that they had accumulated over their lifetime in Bitcoin, as opposed to being in a bank account in Syria that they couldn't access once they had gotten to a refugee camp, their lives could have been totally different. They wouldn't have had to sacrifice anything in terms of economic, their economic status, and they could just pick up and start all over again. So the suffering that many people experience as a result of these conflicts could have been mitigated or even prevented altogether. And I think to me, like the three key pieces of this technology which make it special and potentially transformational, each mapped to one of my experiences during my 3 deployments. So immutability, so the immutability of a ledger that exists and persists beyond just a single person, that keeps a pile of papers like I showed you, like was my job that I showed you a few slides ago. You know, this idea that you can persist data and records across individuals, across time, across institutions, and can't be changed unless, again, you follow the system of cryptographic proofs that kind of creates it. So that immutability is a really, really powerful feature of blockchains that would, you know, that can help in many ways create a trusted institution in and of itself. The second really key piece of blockchain technology, which I think is important and potentially transformational, is auditability. I went through my whole story about Iraq, and sadly, Iraq is not the only example in the world where money that is well-intentioned or resources that are well-intentioned gets siphoned off and spent in places that it shouldn't be spent. I mean, the worst probably example, probably in terms of total dollars spent, is Haiti. Again, one of the poorest countries in the world by development index. And you know, that place, again, there's just no accountability for the funds that go there. So the nice thing about blockchain is it enables you, because of its immutability, you can trace all of the payments wherever they go. And so for a use case like charity, you know, you can audit those things much more easily and ensure that it's getting to the right people at the end of the day. And the last piece is liberty. And this is really the most relevant piece as it pertains to the Syrians and their experience, where again, like, these were people that played by the rules their entire lives, and suddenly the rules changed and they had absolutely no recourse. And to me, this is the most, I guess, the one that hits closest to home, because I joined the military to serve and defend the United States, and I'm a big believer in American values. And I think one of those most important values is liberty, is that all of us, you know, have fundamental human rights that we should have the ability to exercise. That's a core belief that unites all of us, no matter what side of the political spectrum that you're on. And so this technology, unlike many technologies out there, if you think about, you know, kind of the modern emerging technologies that kind of favor these strong centralized institutions, cryptography and cryptocurrency technology is something that favors the individual. No one can take your Bitcoin or your assets issued on a blockchain, because only you control the cryptographic key. And I think that's a really, really special thing. And these three things come together to enable, like, what I consider a new, an entirely new frontier of potential institutions that can enable human coordination for the 21st century. So these are not, like, this isn't going to completely, we're not going to reinvent our existing governments, we're not going to reinvent our existing financial system, but this is a new tool that we can use to coordinate. And I actually think of it as an extension, or as the natural progression from, again, being so like I said, being an American patriot and having served, like, the Constitution is a document that's very important to me. And the Constitution, the idea of writing down what we all agreed upon collectively as principles and governing based on those principles, at the time, we take for granted now, but at the time was really revolutionary. And blockchain technology and smart contracts and things like Bitcoin, to me, are the natural progression of this idea, where not only do we write down these principles, but we cryptographically secure them. And you know, only by the rules that we all agree upon at the beginning, you know, that's the only way that things can change. And so this is another mechanism by which we can coordinate. And I really think it's critical, given how more and more of our lives are lived online every day. The more and more of our interactions become digital, the more important that it is to have a tool like blockchain, like cryptocurrency, like cryptography, to ensure that we can maintain our liberty, we can ensure that our interactions, like particularly financial interactions, are auditable, and that we have an immutable record of interactions that we can rely upon, such that no institution, no single person can ever take that away from us. And so to me, that's the promise of blockchain technology, and that's how I got into it from my career in the US Army. Thank you all very much for having me today. It's a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you.